Hey everyone, James from TDB here, bringing you another in-between episode. Today I am going to be doing the Q&A episode, so first of all, thank you for everyone who sent in questions. Really appreciate those. Always fun to do one of these, just to do some random topics that I wouldn't necessarily pop off my head. Always good to hear what people are actually interested in. So yes, we will be working through all of these questions. You can stop sending them in as well. So this one is from Harry Crab 8725. Do you have a go-to recommendation for ripe and raw, or 3 for guests who are new to Pu'erh? Not necessarily mom tested, maybe more complex, even dank. Really give someone a good first time Pu'erh experience. He provides answers as well. For ripe, he said YS brand has some nice offerings. Raw is tougher. He'd lean towards an HDU, something dank that transforms to sweet. This is a interesting question. It's a good question, but it's also a challenging one because Pu'erh is a very diverse subject, and there's a pretty big variety of flavors. And just because someone doesn't like the flavors of one type of Pu'erh doesn't mean they're necessarily gonna like or dislike the flavors of other types of Pu'erh. Of course, it's totally possible to dislike Pu'erh generally, but it's one of those categories where you have to try different things. So you really need to, if you are introducing someone to Pu'erh, you need to be quick to kind of like move on to the next category. It's something they don't like. So I think in the past I've kind of categorized that versus like you can have young raw, you can have more aged raw that is like a little more traditionally stored, or definitely like kind of brewing like in red or brown. You can definitely have ripe. You can also have semi-aged. This would categorize kind of like semi-aged with like a drier storage, so something like Kunming or Western storage. Or you could have something that's a little bit more humidly stored, so Taiwan, Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Malaysia, that sort of thing. I personally like to start in kind of the middle of the ground. I would probably say kind of something semi-aged that's not too strong, not too rough. I think the recommendation of like a semi-aged Iwu, something like 10 years old. Personally, I think when you're introducing someone to that, I prefer to introduce them to a little more aggressive storage. So something like Taiwan or Hong Kong. Doesn't need to be super aggressive, doesn't need to be traditionally stored, but something that's going to give it a little bit more of a push than like kind of something very, very dry stored. And then depending on how they like that, if like, for instance, the bitterness puts them off for that, then you might want to lean more towards the darker tea. If it's something like the funk or whatever is starting to rub them off, you might want to lean more towards the young tea. If they prefer something smooth, that might become fairly obvious at some point, and leaning more into aged tea or ripe. So I think there are a variety of ones. As far as different categories, I like Iwu too because it's kind of a softer profile. It's not super brash. Some people are going to like that brashness, but I would not start. It's kind of like one of those things where you want to guess the number, so you should always guess right in the middle, and then you kind of calibrate from there. Someone that might really like the strong tea, you start them off in the middle, and they're like, okay, I actually want something bolder, stronger, and eventually you might end up in something like really strong Lauman, something like that. But I wouldn't necessarily start with that. Okay, so this one is from Doug. How much does year matter in your opinion compared to other factors like quality of material, processing, and storage? Given a tea from the same mountain producer and storage from a dry and hot year versus a wetter, colder year, how much influence does this have on the final product, especially in a tea that has been aged for 10 to 15 years? Are there any years that stand out for you for teas from a particular region like Iwu or Manga? Real quickly, I actually wanted to go back to Harry Cramp's question. I realized I didn't fully answer it. Ripe, I think wine Yunnan sourcing is a good one. I think the gold standard is probably Dai. Dai has very solid ripes, and they're kind of like what people are going to gravitate towards. And then something strong like a young raw, young Iwu, those are good options. I wouldn't necessarily start with those. And then something a little smoother and older, that's always nice to go to. Those can be a little bit harder to find, but something traditionally stored from Yian, like Best Taste is a good kind of traditionally stored ripe. Okay, so back to Doug's question. So I would say it's hard to say how much the year matters, because one thing that becomes apparent too is that weather is very fickle. So it's like if it rains one week, then the tea harvested before that week might be fairly different from the tea harvested after that week. And so I'm not someone that's had boots on the ground in Yunnan or anything like that. So it's hard for me to speak towards that being like a big, like one big year or not. I'm also not quite into boutique enough Pu'erh to say that there's like a real standout year. I also tend to gravitate towards blends and whatnot. So generally speaking, I think earlier is better for Pu'erh. Part of that is because it's more aged. Another big part of that is that quantity has really increased in Pu'erh, which dilutes the general quality that's happened. I think this is especially observed to be true in like the 2000s, the aughts, where tea from earlier in that decade is markedly better, but also markedly more expensive. So I personally would rate most of those factors above harvest, but again, I'm not someone that has boots on the ground. I think if we talk to a vendor that's actually going farm to farm and actually can get reliable data on the pick dates, another thing I can't get, they might have more of an opinion, an informed opinion on that. So someone like Farmer Leaf or Yunnan Sourcing White Tea, one of those guys. Okay, this one is from Cool Chicken Boys. If you had 2 to 3 cakes or bricks to choose from your top 3 favorite Pu'erh factories, what would they be and why? Good question. I think in terms of Pu'erh factories, I'd probably take, or just Pu'erh operations, I'd probably take a boutique Yu. I think Chen Yuan Hao is a really reliable vendor for those. I'd probably take something that's on the older side of things, like their 2003 Chen Yuan Haos. If price is no object, those are a pretty good option. They have some really solid tea, and generally speaking, kind of in answering to Deg's question too, earlier you go, the better, just because, not necessarily because the material is way better in 2000 versus 2009, although you could make that case. I think it's more that there's more competition and more people pressing. Dai, I think, is a really solid option. I definitely drink my fair share of factory tea. I definitely pick some sort of aged factory blend. I think, for me at least, the ideal age range for Dai is definitely more aged, so 30 plus years ideally, just because we're talking in hypothetical fantasy world. I like 8582 from them. I also like 7542. And why not? Let's toss in the other big factor, Shaguan. I think 8653, Iron Cake 8653. Let's go 1986. Why not? Those teas are just really, that's kind of their signature blend, and I do like that a fair amount. This is from Burbling Barbacoa 4944. Bovetta's humidity packs for storing Pu'erh. Yes, I do use those. It's going to depend on your conditions. If you are living in Florida and you can keep it like humid enough on its own, maybe you don't necessarily need them. But for my room temperature and things like that, for instance, right now it's actually fairly humid in here. It's 57 RH. But if you want to consistently keep it in the 60s or even 70, you really do got to bump up that humidity. So I do believe in humidifying Pu'erh. Okay, so now we have a bunch of questions from Mr. Ertan. Hello, which business do you find more shady, Pu'erh tea or Yixing teapots? Okay, that's a fun one. So I would say for me personally, and I think this might say more about me than it does the industries, because I know one industry a whole lot better than the other ones, and I would say I find Yixing's more shady because it's more mysterious to me. I know less about that. I know less of how I'm going to shop online and pick these ones. When I did pick my Yixing teapots, which by the way was over 10 years ago at this point, I basically just did it off of recommendations from people that I generally trusted. I never became great at being like, oh, that's like a 90s sort of clay from yada yada. So for me at least, I find the Yixing thing shady, but it's probably because I just know a lot less about it. Whereas Pu'erh, I kind of know what the I know kind of the popular pitfalls and things to fall for. Not that I'm perfect or anything like that. I just am a lot more familiar navigating that space, if that makes sense. Do you have a specific Pu'erh cake that you bought new and feel did not age great in your own storage? Not really. I'm sure I do, but I'd have to dig in there and dig it out and be like, not sure about this. Generally speaking, I am the most dubious on how kind of northern Linsong tea is going to age, or at least that I'm going to be satisfied with that product. But I haven't bought all that much of that anyways. I'm sure I have a cake or two lying around somewhere in the back, but I couldn't name those necessarily. And I also haven't tried those in a while, so I can't verify that it's indeed, maybe it's aging a lot better than I think. Who knows? Okay, this is also from Mr. Ertan. Do you sometimes blend a couple of teas just before putting them in your gallon? Yes, I do. Usually this is like to finish off samples, so it's like if I am drinking ripe, so something super casual. it's like a session is 10 grams and I got 3 grams left, I'm not going to throw away those 3 grams. I'll toss it in with 7 grams of the next tea I'm going to brew. So yeah, I'll do stuff like that very casually. I have a like just a Mylar bag of like good wooey tea. It's very small, and it's like when I'm like done with the wooey and there's like 2 grams left, I'll just toss it in there, and then eventually I'll make a session out of it or something like that. Last question from Mr. Anton. Baby drinking tea, or are you afraid of the caffeine aspect? Not necessarily that afraid of the caffeine aspect, but no, she's only 8 months old, so she's not drinking tea yet. I'm sure she will at some point, but I'll have to talk with my wife about that and have a good solid plan of when to start, but I think it's too early. This one is from Douglas Michaels 7760. Any trick for brewing pu'erh at altitude? How do you retain the most heat possible in the gaiwan at 5,000 feet? I feel like I get slightly less out of my pu'erh tea than at sea level. But when I go up to 9,000 to 12,000 feet, there's a very steep decline, and it seems like only green and oolong brew well. Good question. Unfortunately, I only have experience steeping near sea level. I mean, of the things that you have control over, you have control over the vessel, so probably selecting a vessel that's going to retain heat is important. I could imagine a world where bigger vessels, which tend to keep their heat better, might steep a little bit better. I'm not totally sure. You'd have to do some experiments on that. And the other thing you can do is just steep longer. You can't change the boiling temperature or anything like that without any significant degree of fussing. So yeah, I'm curious if anyone else has experienced brewing tea in elevation. It would be interesting to hear from you as well. This, of course, is also a very practical thing because usually a lot of the tea vendors are in the mountains, and so they're at elevation. So when different people are going into the mountains and trying teas, they're not trying it at sea level necessarily. I'm sure they will at some point, but so I'm sure a lot of vendors have experience with this, trying the tea in mountains, coming down the mountains, or bringing it back stateside or to Europe or something, and then trying the tea and seeing how it's different. I don't have much of an opinion on that because I, again, brew just about all of my tea near sea level, and I can't even remember the last time I brewed tea at any sort of elevation. This one is from Jay Hagra. Could you define the taste characteristics of Hong Kong storage or Hong Kong stored teas per se? For Heicha, do you find there are certain tastes that are typical or favored by traditional Hong Kong storage as opposed to dry storage? Are there any taste notes that you would connect more to storage rather than to the tea itself? Thanks, John. Definitely. I would say the earlier steeps tend to show a little bit more of the storage. Generally speaking, Hong Kong pu'erh is going to have a very distinctive taste. It traditionally stored, that is. You can store pu'erh certainly in Hong Kong in a couple different ways, dry stored or traditional, but I think usually when people are referring to kind of this Hong Kong storage, they're referring to it being traditional. The tea is definitely going to get smoother, it's going to get woodier. There's going to be, a certain aroma that's coming off of it too. For me personally, I like those, and it's a little hard to describe, so it's one that I definitely recommend people get experience. It's not the same thing as ripe. So if you think you've just gotten that experience through ripe, I would say you're probably not correct on that. Smoother, softer. For me at least, it's a very comfortable drink to go down. So I really, really like Hong Kong traditional storage for just kind of regular, ordinary brews, things that are not overly fussy. I don't think it's a particularly subtle flavor profile either. So I definitely recommend people go check that out. This one is from X-Ray Style X. Possible adverse health effects from shoe pu'erh, mold toxins, and difference in quality or taste between normal 300-year-old tree and high-priced pu'erh from core areas like LBZ, being Dao Lao Jai, and classic Yiwu areas. So these are two questions I don't know that I can really answer very satisfyingly. Adverse health effects from shoe pu'erh, I don't know. I mean, I drink it regularly. I haven't noticed anything for myself, but honestly, that's all I can speak towards. The studies that have come out, I don't know, are varying degrees of convincing. I mean, one of the studies comes out and it has certain mycotoxins or whatever, and their conclusion is basically just rinse the tea. That was one that has been circulating for a while. So someone that knows more, please chime in, or has a stronger opinion. Difference in quality, this is hard to say because this is one of the things, so when we're talking about tree age and whatnot, I don't have boots on the ground. I don't know. I can't verify these teas. So it's something that I mostly choose to ignore in terms of like tea age, like tea tree age. I don't find it to be particularly important from my point of view as kind of like someone that's way out there. I don't doubt that old tree tea does taste different. But, with someone that's unable to verify, I just kind of take the teas on a case-by-case basis, and I don't necessarily draw conclusions about the tree age being superior one way or the other there. It's just more like, do I like this EU production versus this EU production? This one is from Smoke Culture 5035, brewing Dragon Balls versus brewing a similar sized portion of a full cake. Are there advantages to one over the other? Lots of places offer 25-gram samples and Dragon Balls of the same material. Which, if any, is better when trying a new pour? I am not a fan of Dragon Balls. In fact, I just released a episode on that, how a lot of them are really compressed and they're really intended for kind of single sessions for like newer people for tea, but I actually don't, in my opinion, maybe it's a controversial opinion, I'll know by the time that this video is released. I don't think they're ideal just because of like the way that they unfurl. Usually when you're actually breaking up a cake or whatnot, you want to break it up pretty good. You don't want to just brew one big chunk that's super compressed, or you're going to get a really uneven session. So I do strongly recommend people actually kind of break up the cake. So I would definitely choose the 25-gram sample over the Dragon Ball material. So yeah, I would give that advice to just about anyone. Okay, this one is from Dim Lamp Light. In your opinion, what are some underrated, cheap, and tasty raw and ripe pours that you feel don't get talked about enough? Good question. So I mean, in terms of ripe, honestly, it's the most well-known one, but I feel like dai ripe almost doesn't get quite enough. People are always searching for something. It's not particularly sexy, not particularly interesting, I guess, to talk about necessarily, but dai ripe is a really solid option if you just want to drink some very solid ripe tea. I mean, they are kind of the gold standard for a reason. So, some people, a guy I know definitely finds no reason to veer outside of kind of that main category. I like to try the boutique ripes on occasion, and I will go through cakes of them. There are some that I definitely enjoy more than others, but I still drink dai ripe very regularly. It feels kind of basic to be like, oh, that's a little underrated. Another thing that I find to be underrated are kind of the big cakes. I just like the big cakes per gram. I think you find out they come out quite well. So I'm a strong proponent of recommending dollar per gram calculations. So yeah, I like big cakes. I think in general, semi-aged continues to be fairly underrated and undervalued as far as tasty raw goes. I don't enjoy drinking young raw as much as I do semi-aged or more aged raw. So I think that's definitely one underrated. And for me at least, I've been talking about tea for a long time, so these should not be particularly surprising if you've seen a good number of my videos. But traditionally stored tea, I think both raw and ripe, I would definitely recommend people check out traditionally stored ripe as well. I think definitely gets underdrank and underrated in a way as well. So it's not going to be for everyone, but I do recommend people check those out. Are there any raw and ripe teas that you feel don't deserve the hype? I don't like the village chasing, and especially when it gets into super hyper focused areas. It's like these specific trees for this garden. I think that stuff gets way too hyped for what it is. So if you're going to talk about kind of the sub areas, I think it's more informative for me at least to talk about kind of the bigger sub areas, so like Iwu, or talking about fairly big villages like eastern Menglan County, so even Guofengjai is somewhat. But when you're talking about specific gardens and that sort of thing, I just don't find that to be that worth your while. What's your take on Yesheng purple material made into raw pu'erh? I generally think the pu'erh oddities can be fun, but I don't think that they're the material that I necessarily gravitate towards when I'm like looking for something solid to buy. I'd be happy to sample that kind of stuff now and then, but I think generally speaking you want to stick with kind of the mainstream raw pu'erh when it comes to that, rather than trying to find something kind of odd. They're fun, but I don't find them to be that much worth my time anymore. Does the razor blade bitterness ever age out through wet storage? If we're talking about like Lao Manu or we're talking about Yeshang, I'm not sure. But if we're talking about like Lao Manu, that's a good question. I don't know. Because some of that bitterness is really pervasive. And the thing that partially leans me towards maybe not is the fact that some ripe pu'erh from these areas will still have a very strong bitterness to them. Will time get it out? I'm not sure. But I do think most bitterness will age out. I'm talking specifically this kind of like aspirin pill-like bitterness. Denny was drinking a lot of white tea during 2020. What are his top 3 faves? I have to ask Denny that. He has not the greatest memory, so I'm not sure if he would even be able to answer that. Do you dabble in any aged white tea cakes? No, I don't. I haven't really done them. Why haven't you tried the Jingyang Fu aroma on the Silk Red Fu Cha yet? Actually, we have. And I'm not sure at what order these are going to be released, but that is an episode. We filmed a normal episode on that. So that will definitely be released at some point. This is from Jiahao Tan 696. I just had a tasting and was about to buy at a shop with the 2022 Iwu raw cake. First, the owner let me try some Rogueway Cassia Yancha he was brewing. I had some and then said I don't like the taste of Rogueway from experience. Then after some pu'erh, I told him I don't like the Iwu. Tasted like water to me. He said you're probably brewing it too thick and cannot taste the subtleties in tea. I was uncomfortable since he let me try stuff. I purchased some 2020 raw Dragon Balls and left. Just a story to share, but feel free to explore the various themes and questions in this little recount. I getting experience buying tea in shop is something that maybe not a lot of people that are just buying tea online are going to have. And it's an interesting experience for sure, because you are subject to how they brew the tea. And when you're talking about something like Young Raw, all tea is sensitive to brewing parameters, but Young Raw and Yancha are really sensitive to brewing parameters. And depending how you do it, like if you brew Yancha by loading the pot up with a lot of leaves, which is a style I personally enjoy, it's going to come off very different. Again, if you're at sea level versus like high in the mountains, that's also going to come off very different. So that's why it can be very valuable to go to a vendor. You think it might be interesting. You can never be totally sure at the shop. You buy a little bit, you bring it home, you brew it under your own conditions where you have more control and you also have a better understanding. And it's also just frankly probably a more comfortable experience where you aren't worried about kind of the social pressure of someone else watching you do that. That's very different. I think erring on the side of caution is definitely smart. If someone is brewing their pu'erh really light, there are some people, and I think I mostly subscribe to this too, specifically Marshall, that talks about how if they're not brewing it with boiling water or whatnot, they're just trying to cover up for the flaws of the tea. And I think there's definitely some truth to that. I don't know if that was the case in this story or not, but I think giving the tea a stress test, and if you know what it should taste like in a stress test, I think that's, those are valid things to bring up. One thing you could do is you could ask the vendor say, hey, I'm actually interested in this tea. Could I have a small chunk and I want to brew it on my own and see how it does. So let's see. He continues on. Just a story to share. Thin versus thick tea. Correct water and kettle. I use a Tetsu bin. Tea shop uses spring water, which I assume is a big plastic container of mineral water connected to his apparatus. Also very important. Water, definitely a thing that often gets underrated in the equation of tea, especially once you get used to the water. I mean, if you've just traveled around and tried water from different places, it just tastes different. Some places have much better water. Pacific Northwest, where I'm based, generally and speaking, has a good reputation for water, but other people might like it. Our water is very low TDS, but if you go to Southern California or something like that, you're going to have very high TDS water. Certain areas of the world, you're going to have mostly be drinking bottled water and that kind of thing. Subjectivity in tea, taste of you, customer versus tea shop experience, or self versus experts on how to drink your tea. Yeah, no one should be able to tell you exactly how to drink your tea. If you like your Iwu brewed strong, your Young Raw, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think that's pretty normal. It's certainly something. I think I spoke to a lot of those themes earlier. This one is from the Siastic63. Do you have any favorite or most often consumed white teas? I don't. This is probably one that I'll have to toss to Denny to name his top 3 whites. Knowing him, he probably doesn't drink white tea anymore anyways. I'm not totally sure. Okay, next one is from dbuck4602. Thanks for taking our questions. Of course, if you could make a scale from most dry to most wet storage, taste, and drop popular storage regions, Kunming, Hong Kong, Taiwan, others maybe not so popular on the scale, how would you line them up? I'm not so interested in the average humidity of those regions. They're easy enough to look up. What I'm most curious is how the wetness of the storage affects the taste or dankness, and how they compare to one another. Maybe these regions would fall in the same spot of both scales, humidity and dankness, but if not, I'm curious, how would you scale them? Thanks in advance. Yeah, I think this is an interesting one. I would definitely put probably on the dry side of things, Beijing, and stuff in kind of like the more northern areas of China. Beijing, and honestly, if we're being honest, a lot of the West, the US and Europe is probably closer to Beijing than it is otherwise. So I'd probably put, I don't know, a lot of the West, which is like obviously a huge area, the West minus places like the South. Up next, probably right next door to Kunming. I think those are all pretty on the dry side of things. I think this is a reason why kind of the culture of storing tea is also important, because I would say Taiwan tea, if someone told me Taiwan versus Hong Kong, I would need to have a lot more, I would have a lot of questions about the specifics there. But if they are talking about Hong Kong, they might mean Hong Kong traditionally stored, which I would say is probably more humid. So Taiwan, I would say, is probably kind of in the next up. Taiwan and Guangzhou, I'd probably rank about equally. And then Hong Kong after that. And then Malaysia is a real tricky one. You might want to put Malaysia in parallel with Taiwan and Guangzhou, but the nature of it is fairly different. And I've talked a lot about this with one of my Malaysian friends who lives locally, and I have tea with now and then. And his big belief is that just because there's less seasons there and the temperature and humidity doesn't swing, talking about Malaysia, but this could also include Singapore for sure, doesn't swing as much because it's so close to the equator, that there's less of a mold risk, even though in absolute terms the temperature and the humidity is higher than a lot of those places I just talked about, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Guangzhou. So in actuality, it doesn't taste quite as wet as those areas necessarily. It's something where I would need a lot more reps to be sure, but that does generally line up with the tasting experience. And we are fortunate enough to have, a fair amount of tasting, Malaysian tasting options from places like Teas We Like, Adventure, and Teacup. I would say probably Hong Kong. If you just told me Hong Kong would probably be at the most humid of that, not necessarily, more because of like the storage culture and what it means, Hong Kong storage means when we're talking about that. Shanghai would probably be closer to Beijing or the West, probably close to the West, I would say. That's kind of my very casual, off-the-cuff ranking of these. Yeah, I would say the wetness of those areas definitely does affect the taste. Even within those categories, there is kind of quite a range there. Okay, this one is from Matthias Schnitger 540. Can you describe different characteristics of single regions? I asked for a follow-up here to ask which regions he wanted. I don't think he responded. So, generally speaking, UUT is a little softer, but can still get quite strong as far as Pu'erh goes, but has kind of a strong inherent strength, good aftertaste, and things like that. When we move over to the west, so kind of like Monghai County area, so things like Bulong, Nanol, it's going to be punchier. There's going to be more kind of outward bitterness, but it will also have a really nice, strong aftertaste. Once you get north, the profiles start to get a little different. Linsong is sort of known for kind of grassier profiles. The areas north of Yiwu, like Jingwu, tastes a little different too. It tastes a little Yiwu-like, but also fairly soft. Jingmai tea, a little fruity, things like that. So I don't know. Different people can describe these better. This one is from Son of Saturn 1. Hi James, I recently bought a cake of 2004 FT86533+1. I want to know about what Feitai actually means. This is a separate company that gets a recipe off Shaguan to create the blend using their own material, or do they commission Shaguan to produce this blend for them? My impression is that it is a separate company, and they work with Shagwan to create it. So I guess maybe a combination of the two. So yeah, Feitai is definitely one you're going to run into fairly often. I kind of treat it as like a cousin of the original. There are other factories that also will go ahead and do this. Feitai, I believe, at certain points worked with Munghai Tea Factory as well. You can find some productions there. That's why Love Forever Paper Tong is kind of an unusual Feitai one, because it supposedly comes from kind of leftover Munghai County material that they may have been pressing at the time. There's also DX. There's a bunch of different brands. Some of them work with Shagwan. Some of them work with others too. So treat it as separate from Shagwan. It's kind of their own version of the 8653. I would say in general it's like a little less punchy. It's supposedly for the Taiwanese audience. There are like rumors of triad connections, who are like the Chinese gangsters. I don't know. I can't speak to any of that stuff, but it does kind of add to the lore and the fun of it. This one from AlexWeb1324. How many samples is enough to get a good feel for a Pu'erh region and its characteristics? Good question, and I think it depends. Like if someone has a lot of experience trying Pu'erh already, and then they're like, okay, I have 2 years of trying Pu'erh, now I want to really get into Jingmai Pu'erh, they might be able to do it in less time than someone else. But I would say probably so when you're trying to get a feel for the region, I would say you want to get a feel for it young, but you also want to get a feel for it a little older. So you kind of want to taste those two things. And when you want to get a feel for it older, I'd say you want to probably taste 2 storages there. So you want to focus on those two. So make sure you have a selection of those. I would say, 3 young teas, and then probably 4 or 5 older teas, ideally from a couple different storages. So maybe 8 different samples to get like a really good feel for it. And you want to make sure you have a couple reps of each samples. I would say at least 2 reps of them. 1 is oftentimes, in my opinion, not enough. Obviously more is better, but I think you can get somewhat of a feel from trying a tea twice. Okay, this one is from Sia1759. They say, I'm really fascinated by long-term Pu'erh storage and aging. I'm in the middle of building my own storage and would like to know out of your cabinet, what is one tea you are most excited about? I'm excited in general for the tea that is too strong still, just to see what will eventually come. So I have some like Munghai blends from like the mid-2000s. Those could definitely be fun. I also sourced a couple teas from Chirodo in Wenatchee, whose storage is definitely on the dry end, so those are definitely projects. So I'm most curious about the ones that are a ways away. Stuff like Yangqing Hao, I more or less kind of like know what that's going to be. It's already had its more intense storage over in Tainan in Taiwan, and things like, and so I don't expect it to change too fast there. So most excited about kind of like the transformations that will happen. When do you think it will be ready, and what do you expect from it, if you expect anything at all? Well, I'm trying to temper my expectations quite a bit. I don't expect the tea to age particularly quickly, and a lot of that has to do with kind of reasons we talked about here. Because I'm not upping the temperature like someone like Marco, I don't think the tea is good. I think it'd be unrealistic to expect the tea to age really fast over even 5 years. So looking at really fairly long time horizons, generally speaking, my recipe for buying tea is to buy something that's had kind of a head start at aging. I think this is less important for Iwu, although I still do it, but but almost essential for factory tea. So buying something that's been stored in Taiwan 10 to 15 years, or Guangzhou or Malaysia for 10 to 15 years, and then bringing it over and then storing it for like another 10 years. I think that's kind of probably the most common formula for what I'm looking for. If I bought something that's more dry stored, then I would probably be looking at twice that amount of time in my storage. That's just a guess, because I don't know. I've been storing tea, I guess, at this point for close to 10 years, but it's still definitely on the young end. And while I will say it has been changing, and when I do open the Pu'erh, it smells pretty great, it's not changing quick. And that's something that I think everyone should kind of go in. Long-term storage is really kind of a game. So that is a really long game. So you have to think really close. It's like, am I more in love with the idea of just storing Pu'erh, or do I think actually, is this something I actually want to go through with? Because it's something you're going to have to honestly carry through a couple different phases of life depending on how old you are. It's like, do I want to be carrying around this tea 20 or 30 years from now? Obviously, for myself, I answered that question yes. But, I think it's completely normal, probably more normal, to be like, not sure about that. Maybe I'll store a little bit, but not too much. So when we get to the level of storing stuff in like big cabinets or Eurocapes like I do, it's just, it's a big space and time commitment. This one is from Dolce Bellaminis Expertise 4147. When do you guys usually have your tea sessions? Any after dinner sessions? I really enjoy ripes after dinner and before bed. I could totally get enjoying ripes. I actually don't drink tea very much past like 2 or 3 in the afternoon. I'll have a little bit of tea after lunch. And generally speaking, I just find I sleep a little bit worse when I have sessions. Like if I meet with a friend and have tea at like 3, oftentimes I find it worth it because I enjoy those tea sessions, but I do find it impacts my sleep. Usually I can still get to sleep fine. My sleep is just a little more restless, a little bit more interrupted. So these days, especially with a small child in the house, I do value getting kind of like really solid sleep. So trying not to overdo it as far as tea goes. The sessions that Danny and I usually have together, basically how it goes these days is we will eat lunch together, and then we'll have basically 3 sessions in a row, filming them, and then I'll release those over the course of 3 weeks. So yes, we do post-lunch. Originally, we worked together in the same office, and so we would just come over after work, which was around 4:35, and film 2 episodes and then kind of go on our way. But that is no longer how we do it. We haven't done it that way for probably 8-9 years at this point. This one, this is the last question. This is from Andre Dumitru. I'm not sure. So sorry, Andre. I'm just not sure where one word becomes the next. Can you tell us some of your most memorable tea sessions and why they were so good? Well, most memorable tea sessions are memorable, one, because of the tea, but also because of the people. I think the people are an extremely important aspect for tea, and it's something that a lot of people in the online tea drinking world will miss out on, because like tea, especially in East Asia, is a very communal thing. Even just going to a tea shop and drinking with someone is still a social experience. So I think the more you can drink tea with people, I think that's good. I think it's healthy. It's healthy to converse with people and things like that. And I would say most of my memorable tea sessions were in those contexts too. I can think of one that was in Hong Kong, and this is kind of relates to the last one. This was an after dinner session, and we had some powerhouse teas. I think we had the 88 Qing Bing in that session, and that was like the 6 tea, and like they were all like factory teas that were brewed super hard. So I really remember that one. So shout outs to Zach, who he wasn't the one that kind of introduced the session, but he was a really helpful guy, in terms of kind of showing us around Hong Kong and different places. And so yeah, I remember bussing back, and I slept like garbage that night, but it was worth it in the end. I mean, it was a very memorable experience. I remember one of the people, the person that brought a lot of the tea, had a very early form of Tesla, and he had it parked illegally, so he was just like constantly watching out for parking enforcement while he's like just pounding some 7542, and then at one point he's like, okay, gotta go, and so he just drove his car around the block while we have like this super strong factory tea that's like 30 years old going. So that was really memorable. My memories, I have some strong memories of drinking some Yellow Mark and Thousand Oaks with Andrew. That was a lot of fun too. Really amazing tea. And that one we could more take our time. I think we only had 3 teas in that day, and we just really took our time with that. And it was kind of like like the big celebratory tea was that 70s Yellow Mark, which is a really fantastic tea. It was Malaysian stored. I think it came from Sue at some point. And so that one, it's a combination of both the company. We had just met each other, but we were having a really good time, and just really, really high quality tea. Let's see. And yeah, of course, my sessions in Malaysia with Sue and Keegan, those were a lot of fun and joy. Obviously, Sue has some amazing teas. If you looked at basically all 800 episodes or whatever we're at in TDB 850, probably the best teas we've had are from Sue, and so just being able to meet her in person and share those teas, drinking some Lu Hei-cha that at this point is probably over 100 years old, that was amazing. Those were amazing teas, but also great company. And so for me at least, the greatest tea session, sort of like food, often revolve not just around the food or the tea, but around having just great company and people to share that experience with. And I think that's maybe a small thing that TDB hopes to do as well. The fact that you can sort of, some people like to put us on while they're having the tea, that type of thing. I think that's great. And just like me having tea with Denny and just kind of the conversation. Are we studying each tea super deeply? No, not necessarily, but the sessions are a lot of fun. And, I think you can kind of get the social vibes that are coming from that too. So yeah, that's a great question to actually conclude on, Andre. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Let me know how you like this episode, and I will see y'all next time. Cheers.